This is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with a remake of a video I did a couple years ago during Burn Month from March till April of 2019. This is updating a lot of the information from those videos. I started back in November, starting to redo this series a little bit with why play Burn. I meant to go in depth at that point, but kind of got distracted by the holidays and such. So we're picking up the project and trying to finish that off from there. We're picking up with a video of utilizing creatures in Burn, and then we're going to be doing kind of an in-depth breakdown of Burn spells and some other stuff in some future videos, kind of going in-depth on a deep dive of information on Modern Burn, as it's kind of my bread and butter. Once we're done with that, we're going to be working on different projects as far as doing very similar things for other decks. That's going to be one of the interwoven projects throughout all the various Burn play videos, as well as all the other different decks that we do, the quick hits, the replays of quick hits and all that. But we're starting out with Burn and creatures in that deck. So that said, let's get into some creatures with Burn and why they are important to the archetype. First off, creatures are more mana efficient and a repeatable source of damage. Unlike spells, which pretty much have a finite amount of damage they can deal, creatures can deal basically unlimited damage depending on the circumstances, and they're important to cast in the early turns as their ability kind of diminishes throughout the game as your opponent potentially draws more answers to them, etc., whereas spells can almost always resolve unless your opponent's playing counter spells. The biggest thing with them is they have the potential to do more damage, so Goblin Guide, can hit for 2, 4, 6, 8, all that. Swift Spear can hit for 2, 3, 4 damage in a turn. Eilon can trigger multiple times if your opponent's casting multiple cheap spells. So they're very good in terms of potentially being able to do damage. They're overall better in non-interactive matchups where your opponent's not fatal pushing them, pathing them, bolting them, or kind of gumming them up with like Tarmogoyf, Death Shadows, Scourge of the Skyclaves, a bunch of cheap creatures out of Heliod, etc. And cheap removal obviously can make them a lot worse. So, like I said, they're better in the non-interactive matchups overall or in the early turns of the game before your opponent can interact with them. As far as creatures that see play in Burn, first and foremost is Goblin Guide. It's probably the most powerful standalone 1-drop in the deck. Really doesn't require any other setup. It does what it does. It can be potential card disadvantage, giving your opponent lands off the top of the deck, but also can give you the knowledge of what's coming off of your opponent's deck. If they're playing a Collective Brutality or a Cryptic Command or a Heliod or a Tarmogoyf, can kind of play around with what your opponent's going to be drawing for a turn or two. This card tends to be left alive a little bit more than some of the other creatures, as your opponent sometimes wants the card advantage of drawing lands. Beyond that, as far as being the most powerful standalone 1-drop, it's not necessarily the most powerful 1-drop, as Death Shadow and Monastery Swift Spear have kind of eclipsed it in terms of the format overall, but it doesn't require you to have additional spells to make it powerful. That said, its sister in the Holy Triumvirate of Burn creatures is Monastery Swift Spear. It's less powerful by itself, needs spells to deal damage, so less damage on turns 1 and 2. In the mid to late game can do a lot more damage. It's harder to block profitably than Goblin Guide. Instant speed spells can make it a lot harder to engage with it in blocks profitably. However, Burn has kind of moved away from instant speed spells to a certain degree, with Skewer the Critic seeing more play. So your range of instant speed spells is probably in between 12 and 16 in the deck. You have Bolt, Helix, Boros Charm, Skullcrack, Searing Blaze in some numbers in the deck, sometimes between 16 to 20 of those. So it's a little bit harder to gauge, what Swift Spear is exactly capable of doing in combat. So a lot of times you have to play face up, Lava Spike into Skewer the Critics. It's very clear that your Swift Spear is attacking for 3 damage. Makes it a little bit easier to predict around that, but still a very powerful thing. Has potential higher upside than Goblin Guide and isn't feeding your opponent lands off the top of their deck, but also isn't giving you the information. And finally, the third of the Holy Triumvirate of most versions of Burn is Eilon of the Great Revel. It has the highest variance of the 3 creatures. It's good when you're ahead, bad when you're behind. So this is a card that comes down sometimes on turn 2, especially if you're on the play. If it's following up a 1-drop, oftentimes your opponents had to use their 1 removal spell on that creature. A lot harder for Eilon to die. they cast a spell to remove it, they take 2 damage. So in the worst case scenario, this is a bad shock. Whenever you're behind, though, it's really bad because you're taking damage off of all of your spells. And it really becomes a problem of managing your life total with this card in play. The onus is to put the pressure on your opponent and this card to come down, cause them a lot of problems. Obviously, it's very good against decks with a bunch of cheap spells, so any type of creature decks that aren't playing Ether Vial, so, sometimes some of the draws of humans, Death and Taxes, etc. Also pretty good against things like elves and such. Pretty good against decks like Storm, was decent against Ad Nauseam when that was a thing. Whole bunch of other decks, does a lot of interesting things in the format. A little bit worse now that a lot of those decks have gotten nerfed, with Simian Spirit God obviously taking a hit, but still overall a very powerful card in those matchups, and is decent against the removal matchups, because pretty much unless they can blanket with a creature, if they're utilizing a spell to deal with it, chances are they're taking damage. Lack of haste is a bit of a problem against like Tarmogoyfs, Scourges, etc., but still a very powerful thing, especially when Prowess is now one of the top aggro decks in the format. In addition to Burn, they often try to chain a bunch of spells, so they often have to take their first spell to deal with Eilon. And sometimes with Lava Dart, they have to take multiple spells, deal with this, taking 4 damage, deal with that often can be problematic for them. So still a very good card in terms of what it does in Burn. The next card up is Lyris of the Dream Den. This card is played as a companion, which means it's a sideboard card that you can reveal at the beginning of the game as long as it meets the requirements, which basically you have to have 2 CMC or less permanents in your deck, which obviously Burn does. Used to see a lot of play when the companion mechanic first came out, has seen a lot less play since the nerf. However, it's still a card you will occasionally see pop up in Burn. Pops up a lot more often in other decks like Death Shadow variants, Mill, a few other decks. Some of the control decks play this when they're playing just like Snapcasters as their main win con. It does give Burn a longer game option in certain metas. Sometimes people play it with cards with like Seal of Fire and Mishra's Bauble. So it is a card that you need to be aware of. It is an option for Burn players. Doesn't often see a lot of play now, but still is a powerful mid-game option in kind of a little bit of a grindier format, especially now that Uro has kind of gone the way of the dodo, and you can actually play a bit of a longer game in some of these matchups. Another card that's been recently printed since the last time we did this was Wayward Guide Beast. It's basically a worse version of Goblin Guide. Basically, it's a 2/2 with Trample and Haste. Whenever it deals damage to an opponent, you have to return a land to your hand. Obviously, the downside of this is it restricts the amount of mana you have in play. You can play around this a little bit by playing a bit of a cheaper deck, maybe playing more 1-drop spells, whether it be more 1-drop creatures and something like 8-whack, or sometimes it's a budget variant in versions that don't want to play like Eilon and such. Maybe can't afford an Eilon or Goblin Guide. This is kind of a fill-in creature. Or if you just want to play 12 1-drops and a little bit of a lower to the ground, like mono red version of Burn. Overall, wouldn't recommend this for normal optimal versions of Boros Burn, but it is a card you can kind of throw in sometimes to mess with your opponent a little bit. And like I said, very good in budget versions and 8-whack variants of mono red aggro. Another card that's kind of gone the way of the dodo a little bit is Grim Lavamancer. This was already a card that only saw Fringe play and Burn last time I made the video, and a lot of the decks this used to be really good against, like humans and Affinity in that. A lot of those decks have kind of gone by the wayside. A lot of creatures have 3 power now, or 3 toughness I should say, which makes this a lot worse. And overall, just not as important in Burn. It does still fight the small creature decks quite well, good against decks like Elves, Death and Taxes, etc. Whenever Burn used to play in Staring Bridge, was a nice card to deal with those situations, allowing you to kind of manage the board until in Staring Bridge you could just kill your opponent. But, did require a mana and graveyard also to deal the damage, so sometimes if you were bringing in with Rest in Peace and against a deck like Dredge, it would be kind of bad. But overall, this is a card that has seen a lot less play. In fact, I don't remember the last time I saw a Burn list with Grim Lavamancer, but nevertheless, it is a powerful option in a small creature meta. Another reason it doesn't see as much play, obviously Lava Dart being printed, makes the card significantly worse when one of the matchups you might want it is against another red-based deck, but that card just happens to get plunked out by Lava Dart, one of the most efficient cards in Prowess. Speaking of prowess, a card you will see played against prowess and against the mirror match is Core Firewalker out of the sideboard. It's a narrow and powerful card out of that sideboard. It's best in the mirror, best versus goblins, best versus mono red, and is it prowess? Can be a little bit hard to cast, taking extra damage to fetch both of your Sacred Foundries, or you're having to sequence like your Sunbaked Canyon, hoping to top deck another white source. You might be taking a little bit extra damage to cast this early on. And it can be troublesome against decks attacking your mana, which obviously isn't quite as relevant in the meta right now. There aren't a ton of Blood Moon decks, there aren't a ton of Ponza decks right now, so that's a little less relevant, but not that you bring those in a lot of those matchups anyway. But still a very powerful card. Kind of hard to answer to a certain degree. Very specific cards, usually Path to Exile out of the mirror match and Kozilek's Return out of the Prowess are the main ways to answer this. Otherwise, you're gaining a life every time somebody casts a red spell. Obviously very powerful when both players are casting red spells. And also sometimes this is a creature you bring in when you suspect your opponent's going to be having Leyline of Sanctity, which a little less frequent than it used to be with Ad Nauseam being a worst deck in the format, and you wouldn't bring it in against Vogels, which is the other main deck that would play Leyline in the format, but still still a very powerful card in the very specific matchups. A card that is the distinction of being the only one banned on this list at some point was wildnicodel. This was a staple in Naya Burn when that was a thing before the Canopy lands and Monastery Swiftspear were printed. It did require a very painful mana base. Oftentimes you'd start at 14, 13 life because you'd have to fetch shock. It's hard to sequence those land drops sometimes. Also, removal has gotten better over time with Fatal Push being printed. So now there's 3 1-drop removal spells that can deal with this before it can ever do damage. And also there have been more efficient creatures that started seeing play. Death Shadow has started seeing play since this was a thing. Scourge of the Skyclaves comes down. Heliod comes up the board, etc. This card's just gotten a lot worse. But once again, it is a card that has seen play in Burn historically, and still is a very powerful thing in a deck that if you're already packing a Tarkus Command, usually sees play more in a Zoo build than a Burn build, but still a very powerful creature that has seen play in Burn in the past. And finally, another dodo, so to speak, is Vexing Devil. This is a 4/3 that comes down for 1 mana, and your opponent has the choice as it enters the battlefield. They can have it deal 4 damage to them. If you do, you sacrifice it. If they don't, you get a 4/3 for 1 mana. Excellent rate. Unfortunately, giving the choice to your opponent is always terrible. And now with Wayward Guidebeast being printed, you have even less of a reason to play this if you want to play an additional 3rd terrible 1-drop in your burn list for some reason. Not much more to say about it. That's pretty much all the creatures that have seen play in Burn. You do see other things like, some budget versions play like Hellspark Elemental. Some Rakdos versions have played Scourge of the Skyclaves. So there are other creatures that can get shoehorned into Burn lists. But these are the ones you're going to see in most things in the modern format as far as creatures that get played. Next video up we'll be doing in this series will be the spells of the Burn deck. I'll try to cover all the main spells that you'll see in the main deck of Burn. I might do a separate video for the sideboard. I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to do that one based on how many spells I end up seeing in the video. We might just do like main deck versus sideboard, so be tuned for that as we'll continue this information series on Burn. And once again, once we get done with Burn, we'll move on to other decks, doing an in-depth deep dive on those decks as well. As always, I have been John for MTG Nexus, and if you like this kind of informative videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving us a thumbs up on this video.